For decades, music fans have argued about a fifth Beatle, and outside of the Fab Four, who made the biggest contribution to the band, George Martin, Eric Clapton, and Billy Preston are usually considered. But a little further down the pecking order is a fascinating figure named Stuart Sutcliffe. He was literally in the Beatles, made an undeniable mark on the band, and, as I'll get into, may have been killed by John Lennon. Stuart Sutcliffe's life has a series of sliding doors moments, the first of which happened in his college years at the Liverpool College of Art when he made friends with another student named John Lennon. Stuart was very talented at art, and this impressed Lennon. At the same time, John was part of the Teddy Boy subculture and big into rock and roll, which impressed Stu. Since 1956, John had started a band called the Quarrymen, which gradually included Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Speaking about Stuart, George said, "Stuart was a thin, arty guy with glasses and a little Van Gogh beard. A good painter. John really liked Stuart as an artist. Stuart obviously liked John because he played the guitar and was a big Ted. Stuart was cool. He was great looking and had a great vibe about him, and was a very friendly bloke." After meeting John Lennon, the second most pivotal movement was in November 1959, when his art career had a major breakthrough. The Liverpool businessman John Moores accepted his work, the Summer Painting, as part of an exhibition. Moores ended up buying the painting himself for £65, which today would be roughly about £1,100 or $1,400. While this big win originally impacted his painting career, it indirectly turned him to music. With this newfound wealth, Stu was cajoled by John to buy himself a bass guitar and join his band, the Quarrymen. According to Paul McCartney, "We all reminded him over a coffee. Funny you should have got that amount, Stuart. It is very near the cost of a Hofner bass." He said, "No, I can't just spend all that. It was a fortune in those days, like an inheritance." Stuart became the bassist and narrowly won this spot over another bassist named Rod Murray. Stuart, by all accounts, was not a great musician, but when he joined the band, he would make contributions that are still known to this day, and makes a very strong case that ahead of Clapton, George Martin, and Billy Preston, Stuart was the true fifth Beatle. The biggest legacy of Stuart Sutcliffe is that he allegedly came up with the name The Beatles. According to George Harrison, Stuart was really into Marlon Brando, and in the movie The Wild One, there is a scene where Lee Marvin says, "Johnny, we've been looking for you. The Beatles have missed you. All the Beatles have missed you." Ultimately, George can't decide whether it was John or Stuart who came up with the name. Maybe John and Stu were both thinking about it at the time, so we'll leave that one. We'll give it 50-50 to Sutcliffe Lennon. The name is inspired by Buddy Holly's band The Crickets, where there was the double meaning of the insect and the British sport. With the Beatles, the double meaning was the insect and the musical beat. The band alternated its name between the Beatles and the Silver Beatles before eventually settling with the Beatles, and Stuart's contribution would not end there. The group performed gigs locally in Liverpool, and their manager got them a residency to perform at a venue called the Indra in Hamburg, Germany. The Beatles did not have a regular drummer, and for this tour they recruited Pete Best, another person regularly called the fifth Beatle. It was during this Hamburg residency that Stuart met the love of his life, Astrid Kircher, despite the fact that Stuart couldn't speak German too well. Astrid recalls that the Beatle mop-top haircut was originally Stuart's idea. According to Astrid, "All my friends in art school used to run around with this sort of, what you'd now call Beatles haircut. He was the first one who really got the nerve to get the Brill cream out of his hair and asked me to cut his hair for him." It was during this Hamburg trip that the Beatles supposedly lost most of their innocence. The city was known for its party atmosphere and red light district, and the band got their first proper glimpse of the rock and roll lifestyle. The Beatles would spend a large amount of time between Hamburg and Liverpool, to the extent that Stuart wanted to stay with Astrid in Germany. But more controversially, he wanted to go back to his first passion of painting and leave the group. The reality is that Stuart did not know that this rock band he was playing with would become the Beatles, and was blissfully unaware of the golden opportunity he had walked away from. Stuart's first love was art, and in Hamburg he got the chance to study under the famous artist Edoardo Palozzi. According to George, Stuart was engaged to Astrid, and after that trip decided that he was going to leave the band and live in Germany because Edoardo Palozzi was coming to be the lecturer at Hamburg Art College. Stu had never really been that single-minded about music. We liked him in the band. He looked great and he'd learned enough to get by, but he was never totally convinced that he was going to be a musician. However, there might be more to it than that. The sad reality is that Stuart was a figure of fun among the Beatles. A lot of the hijinks surprisingly came from Paul, and many felt that he was jealous of Stewart's friendship with John and that Stewart was not taking the band seriously enough. John said, "We were awful to him sometimes, especially Paul, always picking on him. I used to explain afterwards to him that we didn't dislike him, really." Speaking about this, Paul said, "Someone a few years ago said how it was my relentless ambition that pushed Stu out of the group. We did have some arguments, me and Stu, but I actually just wanted us to be a really cracking band. And Stu, being a cracking artist, held us back a little bit, not too much." Stewart had turned down a golden opportunity, but sadly he would not even live to see his friends become successful. With Stewart, we have more than one instance of what could have been. He could have been one of the Beatles, but he could have also become a famous artist. On one of his reports, Eduardo Palozzi said, "Sutcliffe is very gifted and very intelligent. In the meantime, he has become one of my best students." Strangely, Sutcliffe started experiencing headaches and acute sensitivities to light. When these attacks occurred, he suffered from temporary blindness. Then, during one fateful art class, he collapsed. Sutcliffe was taken to hospital, but doctors could not find the diagnosis. An X-ray was taken, and they couldn't find anything wrong with him. Stu was brought back to Liverpool to be looked at. For whatever reason, doctors didn't get down to the bottom of what happened. On April 10, 1962, Stewart suffered from a brain aneurysm. He was taken to the hospital in an ambulance and did not survive the journey. Later that year, the Beatles released their first single, "Love Me Do." Stewart would never live to learn that the band he was in would become the biggest band of all time. When John Lennon heard the news about Stewart's, he apparently burst out laughing. However, this was merely a quite common response to trauma, and John burst into tears afterward. According to Astrid, John went into hysterics. "We couldn't make out whether he was laughing or crying because he did everything at once. I remember him sitting on a bench, huddled over, and he was shaking, rocking backward and forward." Lennon basically tried to ignore the death to the extent that he did not attend the funeral. Over the years, Stewart's memory lived on, and he is one of the many figures seen on the cover of the 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. John and his wife Yoko would also send Astrid Christmas cards every year, and Stewart was clearly a person who meant a lot to John and the other Beatles. As well as the what could have been questions, the most puzzling matter is, what happened? How did a young man in his 20s suddenly die of a mysterious illness? And shockingly, his sister Pauline came to the conclusion that he was killed by John Lennon. Stu's autopsy showed cerebral hemorrhage, which basically means that his brain was bleeding, specifically in the right ventricle. His head had been experiencing these headaches for about a year, and Beatles historians have looked at incidents which may have sparked his mental decline. According to the New Yorker, later, pathologists discovered a tumor caused by a small depression in Sutcliffe's skull, suggesting that his suffering stemmed from an act of violence. The most innocent explanation is that Stewart fell down the stairs and awkwardly hit his head. Stu had his own studio in the attic of Astrid's mother's home. However, it is difficult to put an exact timestamp on when this happened. Another explanation is that Stewart was beaten up in Hamburg by a group of Teddy Boys. Eventually, Pete Best and Paul McCartney came in to break up the fight, but this intervention was arguably too late. One of the attackers delivered a supposedly decisive kick into the head of Sutcliffe, and this is what could have caused the hemorrhage years later. But the third reason is perhaps the most chilling of all. John may have unknowingly killed Stewart. As an artist, Stewart regularly kept a sketchbook which contained work that he dated. His sister Pauline claims that you can trace the deterioration of his mental health through this scrapbook. In October 1961, after an alleged fight with Lennon, there are many scrawls and apating which she thinks reflects the start of what was yet to come. In shaky handwriting, Stewart writes words like torment, shout, explode, and the bloody brain. The biggest argument in support of this is that the sketches from this period contrast with his earlier sketches and reflects an entirely different state of mind. Pauline says that when Stewart was beaten up by Teddy Boys, that was 3 years before his death and before he showed any signs of decline. She said, "The medical opinion is that something in 1959 will not have waited 3 years. Instead, she makes no one, but two very wild assertions." Pauline alleges that John and Stewart's relationships went beyond friends and they were homosexual. This resulted in a furious argument between them, ending with John kicking Stewart in the head. According to Pauline, "I believe that the cerebral hemorrhage that cost Stewart his life was caused by an injury inflicted by John in a jealous rage. A post-mortem revealed Stewart had a dent in his skull, as though from a blow or kick. And a few months earlier, John had viciously kicked my brother in the head in a sustained, unprovoked attack." Pauline also describes Stuart's relationship with Astrid as an affair, and he was cheating on John. When this attack happened, he was bitterly resentful of my brother's affair with Astrid. Now that Stuart had turned away from the Beatles to concentrate on art, John must have feared the end of their relationship. Sadly, the only people who can back up the claim that this fight happened are no longer with us. However, there are others that claim that there didn't need to be an inciting incident for this to happen. The most likely diagnosis for him are an aneurysm and AVM. Both of these diseases are congenital, meaning that they arrive at birth, which leads to an even scarier thought, and how something like this could happen to us all. There are no Beatles songs specifically about Stuart, but one of Lennon's old friends, Pete Shotton, alleges that there are lyrics in the Beatles' hit In My Life that reference Stuart. In 1965, 3 years after Stuart's death, John sang, "All these places had their moments with lovers and friends. I still can recall, some are dead and some are living in my life. I've loved them all." Thanks for watching.